that there's sort of these social norms about what is acceptable and what is unacceptable. And when somebody breaches them and everybody responds as though that was fine, people revise them. And so you gradually start to lose your standards and your compass. Obviously, one organization or one political party that has done that very strongly over the course of the last year is the Republican Party, which was at first horrified by the rise of Donald Trump, which is, populated with people who are deep members of a conservative movement that, I'm not a conservative, you can agree with or strongly disagree with, that had actual beliefs and ideals that have very little to do with what Donald Trump now stands for, right? So as somebody who was a member of that movement and I believe still is, did it take you by surprise to see how people who probably in their own mind thought that they are animated by public policy and they're animated by a view of what's good and bad for America are willing to throw all of that overboard in order to become lackeys of Donald Trump?
Well, I am no longer a Republican, but I do consider myself politically where I have always been, which is center right. And the short answer is yes, I have been horrified. The number of never Trump Republicans, if you will, those people who considered themselves Republican, had always voted Republican, who knew he was trouble at the beginning, knew he was trouble during the election, and have continued to oppose him now because he has done and been everything that we predicted, is pathetically small. It is a fraction of the party. It has virtually no representation in Congress itself because to one degree they have all accommodated themselves. And to the chagrin of those of us who do consider ourselves to be the never Trump, it has intellectually corrupted people in think tanks, people in journals, people in universities, what we thought was the intellectual firepower, if you will, and the organizational might on the right. And I think we have underestimated three things. One is the degree to which tribalism infected both the right and the left, but that the right had the sense of victimization. Woe is me. We've been abused by the left. And although they don't like Trump, they like that he is hated by the same people that they have hated. And the allure of having a champion, and I'm not talking about the unemployed steel worker in Ohio. I'm talking about the guy who does economic policy at Heritage. Finally, we have someone who is just giving it to the other guys. I'm on top. I don't have to take the intellectual and emotional abuse of liberal elites. So that's the first thing. The second problem is that the ability to rationalize one's role in the great scheme of things is tremendous. I have abided most of my life, and certainly my writing life, in the admonition that one doesn't bring up Hitler because that diminishes the importance, but one has to go for an appropriate analogy. And that is that profession after profession, institution after institution, acclimatized themselves to Hitler, both because they underestimated him and they believed they could control, direct, manipulate him. And although Donald Trump is not Hitler, and I want to be absolutely clear about that, the same mentality that the country needs me to be there because without me, they'd be far worse. Because I'm having some effect, because I can think of horrendous things that he has not done, that he might have done had I not been here, is such a attractive narrative for people to allow them to do what they want to do, which is serve in government or have powerful positions, that they have been able to rationalize almost everything. And I think as a psychological phenomenon, as a human phenomenon, I greatly underestimated that. The third is that I think I have come to terms, sadly, with the realization that some of the criticism on the left about the right was accurate. There is a much larger segment of xenophobia, of racism, of a sense of white grievance than I was willing to acknowledge in the past. And so the things that horrify me do not horrify them in the same way. or they maybe don't horrify them at all. And I think because so many of the tripwires for me are those beliefs in democracy, the American experience, immigration, that immediately set me off that it's not such an issue for these people. And therefore, they don't have that visceral reaction when he tries to demonize immigrants as gang members and murderers. It simply doesn't.
There's sort of two ways, isn't there, of putting the point about the way in which the present political moment helps us to rethink the nature of a conservative movement or the Republican Party over the last 20 or 30 years, right? And one is to say that, well, perhaps the things that, occasionally were subtext, but were never text, actually drove much more than we realized. That it wasn't just the occasional Republican politician saying something xenophobic or saying using racist dog whistles, but actually all along held more of the power within the movement and more of the attraction to a large number of the members of the movement, even if obviously not all of them, than we realized. Another point, and those two aren't mutually exclusive, is to say that perhaps also the power of the ideas themselves was much weaker than it seemed. That actually the church of deregulation and lower taxation and all of those things had a lot of worshippers that were there for different reasons. And that in order to rebuild any form of conservative movement, it would require people to actually not just distance themselves from the nasty things that have now become text and that used to be subtext, but also actually to sort of reinvent the liturgy itself, as it were. There's a very labored metaphor now.
I agree, yes and yes. And I think it has been somewhat difficult for my conservative friends and ex-friends to understand that those two things are going on simultaneously. And that, yes, the realization that, as you beautifully put it, that subtext is more text than I was willing to acknowledge is true. But that at the same time, both what plowed the way for Trump and what demands that people who consider themselves to be conservative or center-right, however you want to phrase it, those people who hold those ideologies have to look more critically at the intellectual bankruptcy of where the movement has been after 30 years, which is still stuck in the same dogma, still stuck in the exact same articulation of certain principles that are no longer suited to a 21st century with a whole slew of problems that Ronald Reagan never dreamed of, and certainly Milton Friedman didn't have a chance to wrestle with. To put it in Milton Friedman terms, we have market failures all over the place. And we have market distortions all over the place. And there is a role for government, and we can debate how much it is. But I think this view, personified by, as the left used to call it, trickle-down economics, that if you just reward the rich, all boats will rise, has been disproven by history and disproven by experience. And to keep insisting that it is so is a certain intellectual and moral blindness. We have a serious problem, not just between rich and poor, but that same rich and poor divide overlays urban and rural, overlays race, overlays a whole set constellation of qualities. And that we lack a unifying narrative, we lack a unifying culture, and we lack a means by which we can fill up the center. We've gotten way too sticky at the ends of the economic ladder, both at the bottom and the top. And that those are, if not unique problems that have really blossomed in the last decade. And Republican ideology has not responded to it in a meaningful way.